court in Babylon and to some degree in Medo-Persia. So the court preacher. And we were in chapter 1 as I was talking about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah being taken to Babylon as young men in the first carrying away of the nation of Judah in 605 BC. And their names were changed to Babylonian names from Hebrew to names that were associated with the Babylonian idolatrous system. By so doing, they were trying to change their religion from the worship of Jehovah to the worship of Marduk. To Daniel, they gave the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they gave the name Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I mentioned to you that those names are not complementary. Those were changed names connected with Babylonian idolatry. They put these four men, along with other young men who were brought, who were very bright, understanding science, had the ability to stand in the king's palace, into the school that will be referred to as the school of the wise men. It will be referred to as the Magi. You probably have heard that word. And the wise men from the east. You'll remember at the birth of Jesus, wise men, Magi from the east, came to visit Jesus, not in the manger, the way these nativity scenes depict it, but they were in a house when the wise men came. But they came from the east, and that's this group. They will be called Chaldeans, wise men, soothsayers. All those names are used to refer to this class of people into which Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were enrolled. Then they changed their diet. You will know that under the law of Moses, there were certain foods that were unclean. And the king's dainties would be Gentile foods that were not so governed by the law of Moses. And having done that, in chapter 1, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah determined they would not eat that food. And in fact, as the book gets off, as far as it's getting started, they put their lives on the line in chapter 1 not to eat unclean food. And by the providence of God, they are allowed a 10-day trial. Daniel said, put us on this diet that we're recommending and try us for 10 days. Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, had said, I don't have a problem, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have a problem putting you on the diet, but the king has decreed that you eat this food, and if I don't have you eat this food, you're going to lose weight. And it's interesting, you know, when people lose weight, one of the first places you start to tell it's in the face. And Ashpenaz said, he will look on your faces and tell that you are not being nourished as I've been commanded to nourish you. So Daniel proposed, give us a 10-day trial. And after the 10 days, these four young men were more healthy than any of the ones on the king's diet. And so they were allowed to maintain the purity of their diet. Now, I want you, because this is so very important, to go with me to chapter 1, verse 1. And we get a time stamp, if you please. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, I have given you tonight a list of the rulers of Babylon. If you will look at that list, all of you probably have heard of Hammurabi, the first famous ruler of Babylon, the 6th king of the strong first dynasty of Babylon, and he is known because of Hammurabi's law code. Then there was Nabopolassar. He founded the Chaldean dynasty. He is the father of Nebuchadnezzar II. He assumed the title of king of Akkad. He was a part of a coalition with Cyaxares, ruler of the Median Empire, that overran Nineveh in 612 BC. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. So in 612 BC, Nineveh fell and Babylon conquered Assyria and became a world empire. All right, then you come to ruler number 3, and that's where we are right now. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BC. In Ezekiel 26:7, he will be known as Nebuchadrezzar, and he is the son of Nabopolassar. So when verse 1 talks about Nebuchadnezzar, that is the king that is under consideration, and he is the king of Babylon. Now, I would call your attention to the 21st verse of Daniel chapter 1. Thus Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. If you will look on the Babylonian ruler sheet, you will not find a Cyrus, because Cyrus is the king of Medo-Persia, specifically king of Persia, but became the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And when you studied world history, you studied when you were present, when this was presented in world history, it was presented in your presence as this historical material was laid out. Now, so Daniel continued, that is, he kept on working in the court as a prophet and as a counselor in the king's cabinet all the way through the Babylonian Empire. Hold your finger there and turn over to Daniel chapter 6, a well-known passage of Scripture. In chapter 6, we read, it pleased Darius, now the young people today pronounce it Darius, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. Darius is the king of Media. So when you get to Daniel chapter 6, the Medo-Persian Empire is in force, Babylon has fallen, and you read of the fall of Babylon in chapter 5, which brings up the fact that the book of Daniel is not laid out in chronological order. So if you start reading chapter 1, read through chapter 12, you're going to be in Babylon, and then Medo-Persia, and then Babylon. In Daniel 6, the Medo-Persian Empire is in force. Darius held Babylon until Cyrus arrived. Now, if you will go back to your kings of Babylon, and you will notice from Nebuchadnezzar, we move through evil, some pronounce it Merodach, Neriglazar, Labor-Orsakod, and you get to Nabonidus. Everybody with me? 556, 538. Now notice this. He associated Belshazzar, his son, with him, some pronounce that Belshazzar, as ruler in Babylon. Belshazzar was the ruler in Babylon who was killed when the city was captured by Cyrus. In Daniel 5, the verses I gave, Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as Belshazzar's father. There is a likelihood that Belshazzar's mother was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, making him the grandson of the great Chaldean king. At any rate, the use of father here can signify simply a predecessor. Now, we've studied this before, that father in the Bible does not always mean immediate, but a descendant. It can be grandfather, could be great-grandfather. And the history and often the context will tell you. I'll illustrate it this, this way. In Matthew 1:1, you're all familiar that your Bible begins, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David. Well, there are many years between David and the birth of Jesus. So son there is used as descendant of David. The son of Abraham. There are even more, about 2,000 years between Abraham and Jesus. So son there means descendant of. So you need to be aware of how language is sometimes used. And there it's evident that son does not mean immediacy. Now, if you drop down below Nabonidus, if one takes these approximate years for the reigns of these rulers, he would have the following: Nebuchadnezzar for 43 years, evil Merodach for 2 years, Neriglazar for 3 years, Labor-Orsakod for 1 year, and Nabonidus for 16 years. Now that's 67 years. Remember, chapter 1, verse 21 says, Daniel was in the court through these 67 years. If we assign to Daniel a reasonable age of when he was carried to Babylon, approximately probably 17 years of age, because they were put into school for 3 years. When they graduated, they would be 20 years of age, which was considered an age of maturity, and thus they could embark on their work. So if we assign 17 years, now we're guessing at that because the Bible doesn't tell us, we get the approximate age for Daniel when he was placed in the lion's den in Daniel 6. This at that time would make Daniel at least 84 years old when he was placed in the lion's den. If you just read Daniel straight through, you won't get that. And I would caution our Bible class teachers, it was not the little boy Daniel in the lion's den. At least an 86-year-old man, probably or possibly even 90 years of age, 84 to 86 or up to 90. So you need to know that when you study Daniel. They're probably about 17, and then 3 years for in school, about 20 when they graduate. Now I'll stop here. Any questions or comments? If somebody told me in high school world history has something to do with the Bible, I think I'd have listened a whole lot better than I did. And at 69, I wish I could go back. Now, I'd look kind of foolish in high school world history, but I think I could know a lot more about what was going on. This is so very important. All right, now if you move to chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, and I'm going to spend more time in Daniel than I have some of the other prophets because this is so important for the New Testament. And that's what I'm doing in this Old Testament survey, trying to move us toward the New Testament. In Daniel chapter 2, you're all familiar with this. We've taught it, well, most of you should be. We've taught it in Bible class to the little boys and girls and the big boys and girls in the adult classes. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he saw a great image that had a head of fine gold and a chest and arms of silver and a belly and thighs of brass or bronze and feet part iron, part clay. And the dream scared him. When he awoke the next morning, he couldn't remember the dream. He still had the fear aspect of having dreamed it, but he couldn't remember it. So, if you will notice with me, in verse 5 of Daniel 2, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans. Now the Chaldeans is that class of people known as the magicians, the wise men, the soothsayers. This is the group into which Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah fall. But I want to go back now to verse 2. The king gave the command. Now he's troubled, and he couldn't sleep anymore, but he couldn't recall the dream. So he called the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Notice that. I want to understand this dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. So here's the language they used there. And, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Now you need to understand how they worked. They had a bunch of books of magical arts, and someone would tell them something, and they'd go look it up in their book, and they'd come back and say, this is what that means. Or they might pour oil on water and look at the design that was made, and they would look that up in their book, and they'd come back and say, now this is what this means. Or they might cut a bird open and look at its liver, and then they'd go look that up, whatever the liver looked like, in their book, and they'd come back and say, now this is what this means. That's how they could interpret, because they did not have supernatural power. So they said to the king, tell us your dream, we'll give you an interpretation. Notice verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, what's the next word? With its interpretation. You tell me the dream and the interpretation. Now they said, you tell us the dream, we'll interpret it. You with me? He said, no, I'm commanding you to tell me the dream and the interpretation. And he said, if you don't do it. Now he had quite a motivational speech in mind here. He said to them, if you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. You think that might motivate you? If you don't tell us that dream interpretation, tell me the dream interpretation, I'm going to kill you. I'm not only going to kill you, I'm going to cut you into pieces. All right? If you had been standing there in the midst of these people you would have heard a collective, because they knew they couldn't do it. They didn't have that power. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Conclusion, therefore tell me the dream and its interpretation. All right, they come back and they say, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. Now, in South Georgia language, he would say, you are putting it off. You are buying time to come up with something. If you do not make known the dream to me, there's only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. Now, evidently, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were not present when these Chaldeans came. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is, they say, a difficult thing, a difficult situation that you have put before us, and there's no other who can tell it to the king except, what do they say? The gods. See the plural there? Now in the Hebrew that would be Elohim. But they're speaking in Aramaic. No one can tell you that but supernatural powers is what they're saying. Whose dwelling is not with flesh. So they said God doesn't dwell in a man's body. So there's no man alive who can tell you this. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious. Now, when you get past angry and go to very furious, these folks are in trouble. This is beyond the stage where your parents called all three of your names. So they know they're in trouble. And gave the command to destroy, now notice it, biggest little word in our Bible. A-L-L. All the wise men of Babylon. That would include Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So the decree went out, now notice this, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, to kill them. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Why has the king sent out this harsh decree? Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. Notice, that's implication that these four men were not present in that discussion with the king. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. All right, so apparently Nebuchadnezzar said, I will grant you time. That's how well Daniel was thought of. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. See, that tells you explicitly they were not present. They were not aware of this. That, in order that they might seek mercies from whom? The God of heaven, not the idolaters' gods to whom the magicians made reference, but the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. From whom? The God of heaven. You see that? See how you put that together? Any questions, comments? So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And then you have this blessing that Daniel pronounces. Verse 24, when he had blessed God, thanked God for giving it to them. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said to him, now notice, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. So he stops this destruction. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I found a man of the, do you have captives? I'm sorry? Exile. The captives, literally the sons of the captivity of Judah. So you go back to chapter 1, see, Nebuchadnezzar had made that foray into Judah, and he carried these captives away. So here we have a captive who will make known to the king the interpretation. Now, what had the king demanded? The dream and the interpretation. All right, what did Daniel promise? What? Interpretation. All right, that's only halfway there, isn't it? Or is it? Why not?
And he'd have to tell the dream as well.
You start to say something. Don't pay attention to him.
No, that's what I was going to say.
Anyone else?
Would it by implication, though?
By what?
Would it by implication, if you told him the interpretation of the dream, he would know the dream?
There's another word I'm searching to find where you have a part that is used to include the whole. What? This is a synecdoche where interpretation stands for the dream and the interpretation. See that? So it's more than an implication, but you're on the right track there. Thank you for thinking. So here the interpretation stands for, I'll tell everything the king's demanded. You with me? Questions or comments? The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, notice that. And we would add, in parentheses in our minds, whose Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers, what? Cannot tell the king. Cannot declare. Nobody in this class can answer what you're demanding. What's your first word in verse 28? And but tells you have a contrast. All right, Daniel says there's no man alive, and the wise men had said that, hadn't they? There's no man alive. There's nobody in this class that can tell you what you've demanded. But there is what? There's a God in heaven, which is different from your idolatrous gods. There's a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days, Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. All right, so he tells the dream. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets, who is that? The God of heaven, has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living. But for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Daniel says God's acting to save us. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of what? Fine gold. Its chest and arms of? Is silver inferior or superior to gold? Inferior. Its belly and thighs of bronze, is that inferior or superior to silver? Inferior. Its legs of iron, its feet part of iron and part of clay. Superior or inferior? All right, we're going down then. See that? You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke it or broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now, what do you think Nebuchadnezzar would have said right there? Yep, that's it. Now, if Daniel told him the dream, for what could Nebuchadnezzar look? The interpretation. You, O king, now this is Babylon, king of Babylon. You, O king, are a king of kings. Why? For the God of heaven, have you noticed that repetitive characterization of God? For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. What would Nebuchadnezzar have thought brought him to his position? I'm sorry?
Himself,
No, it goes beyond that.
his God.
His gods. Nebuchadnezzar would have thought, my gods enable me to do all this conquering. Daniel said, you're where you are because God put you there. God allowed you to be there. And whatever the children of men, wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them in your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. So the Babylonian Empire is represented by the head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, and what's your next word there? Inferior. All right, if you have the image in your mind, you have the gold, now you're coming down to silver. Inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Now, if you remember world history, who conquered Babylon? Medo-Persia. And that's what you'll have in chapter 5. All right, who conquered Medo-Persia? Greece. Alexander the Great. And he ruled over all the earth. Historians say, as a very young man, Alexander the Great conquered the then known world. And it is said that he sat down and cried because there were no more worlds to conquer. Alexander the Great was one of the greatest generals that ever lived. He built an army so well conditioned physically that it could march all night and then fight the next morning. And often when Nebuchadnezzar was going against an enemy, his army would march all night while the enemy was asleep. When the enemy awoke the next day, Nebuchadnezzar was there. Alexander was there. And they didn't have time to get prepared, get ready, and he would conquer them. He brought into his army the use of elephants. Now that'd be the tanks of former years, comparison-wise, but he would use the elephants to stampede, to push up against the city walls. Oh, he was quite a strategist. So his kingdom will be over all the earth, but it's inferior to Medo-Persia. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Now that's Rome. And if you read the history of Rome and the conquering of their armies, you notice they spread out and they became world rulers. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. That means it will not be a strong kingdom internally. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly, the New King James here says, fragile, broken,
Mine says
brittle. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another. See, there will not be a cohesion, just as iron does not mix with clay. All right, if you know the history of Rome, when Rome conquered a nation, if that nation surrendered and subjugated itself to Rome, what did Rome do as far as government was concerned for that nation?
keep on ruling the people.
They let them keep their government. As long as they were in submission to Rome and they sent tribute, sent money to Rome. All right, so you have a big world empire composed of all different kingdoms, of all different kinds of governing. And on the outskirts of the empire, those people are not particularly loyal to Rome. So when the enemy eventually came against Rome, those outlying kingdoms surrendered to the enemy, joined with the enemy, and finally made the enemy so large it conquered Rome. It's a weak empire, though it has strength. When it subjugates all these people and lets them rule. For example, when the Jews were conquered, they were allowed to keep most of their government. Sometimes Rome appointed the governors, and that was usually political favors, and they'd send the money to Rome, and as long as they didn't cause an uprising, as long as they didn't rebel, Rome pretty well let them tend to their own business. So that was the weakness of it. All right, now you have Babylon, followed by Medo-Persia, followed by Greece, followed by Rome. Now, verse 44. And in the days of these kings, now if you just followed the progression here, Who would be these kings? I heard something. Rome. All right? It may include all of them, but Rome would be the last kingdom up. In the days of these kings, what's going to happen? All right? Number one, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. Now, the God of heaven, true or false, is a physical, material general with a physical, material army. True or false? I'm getting this, but I can't hear your head. False. What kind of army does the God of heaven use? A spiritual. What kind of kingdom is the kingdom of the God of heaven? Spiritual, not material. And that kingdom will or will not be subject to being conquered. Will not. It'll never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. So see, it will never have but one ruler. Some translations say the sovereignty thereof shall not be left to another. It will never have another ruler. The God of heaven is going to set up that kingdom. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Now this is the church established in Acts 2 on the day of Pentecost. And the way it breaks in pieces and consumes is through conversion. Through the preaching of the gospel, people would be added to the church that had backgrounds in Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. Notice this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So what Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar is, God in this dream has given you a history lesson. And this is a succession of history that's going to come to pass after you. So, you're a great ruler, but you're not going to rule forever. But when the God of heaven sets up a kingdom, it will never be destroyed. So when somebody tells you, if this keeps on, the church is going to be destroyed. No, it's not. The devil doesn't have enough power to destroy the church. Some Christians may be destroyed and give in to sin, but the church will stand forever. And then, because of this, Nebuchadnezzar fell down before Daniel, presented an offering and incense to him, put him in place of a god. Then the king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel. And then Daniel petitioned that he promote Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when that happened, the men of Babylon, over whom these men were appointed, became furious, because you had captives ruling over home folks. And they set out from this time forward to destroy Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Thank you for listening. Those of you on social media, our next broadcast will be Sunday morning at 10 a.m.